So, hello, I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell Book Company. Today, first of all, it's only tonight for some of us, but including our author. But for us, it is still daytime. For front page New York Times bestseller, amazing reviews. Hamnet, out of stock almost immediately. I actually only started reading it when we got copies because we had a galley, it was grabbed right away. So I'm not quite done yet, but I'm loving every second. Thank you to Jane Hamilton for suggesting that I read it. And thank you to Colleen for being my partner in this series and to introduce today's event, Kayleen Rohrer from the beautiful Inklink books of East Troy, which by the way, unlike Boswell, is actually open for browsing. Take it away, Kayleen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kayleen from Inklink Books in East Troy, and it's my really great pleasure to introduce novelist Jane Hamilton, who will be in conversation today with Maggie O'Farrell, author of Hamnet.
Maggie O'Farrell, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Kayleen. Thank you, Maggie O'Farrell, for being here and also for writing this beautiful and remarkable book. I love it so much. It's my favorite thing that I've read in such a very long time. And we hope that someday you can come to the home right now of the Democratic National Convention and other wonders. But for now, we're just so happy that we're here together in this virtual world. So just to begin with, I love your author's note in which you say that you had realized at a certain point that Shakespeare never mentions the Black Death in his plays. And you said that it was idle speculation about that absence. I love that. Idle speculation plus your astounding brain that led you to start to think about Anne Hathaway or Agnes. So I just wonder if this would be a good place to start in terms of after the idle speculation, then what happened?
Well, I mean, it's hard, this book's been a long time coming. I'm sure there are some books that have quite a short sort of gestation and others that are quite long, actually. And this one, it's hard to kind of pinpoint when I decided to write the actual book, but I do know exactly the moment when I found out about the real boy, Hamnet Shakespeare. And it was a really long time ago. It was about 30 years ago when I was studying the play Hamlet at school for my Scottish Highers. And my teacher just mentioned in passing that Shakespeare had a son called Hamnet who died at the age of 11, and that he went on several years later to write the play. And, I have such a strong memory of sitting in a very cold Scottish classroom and looking down at the cover of the play, which I loved, which really got under my skin, and just putting my finger and covering up the L in the name and thinking, but it's the same name, and what does that mean? And, Shakespeare is there's a strange imbalance about him, because we have, on one hand, we have an enormous wealth of his work and his plays and his poetry. And on the other hand, his biography and his actual life, the concrete facts about him are really scant, and so sort of poured over, despite the best efforts of hundreds of brilliant scholars, there's actually very little we really know about him for sure. But it just has always seemed to me that, calling your tragedy, perhaps your greatest play, after your dead son, is an enormously significant act. It carries a huge amount of, it's very, very freighted, and it's telling us as an audience and as readers a huge amount about how he felt about the death of his son, which I feel has been really overlooked by history and by scholarship and academics and biographers. Hamnet, in those big sort of 500-page books you get about Shakespeare, he's lucky if he gets two mentions, that he was born and that he died. And often his death, I always found in those books, is always wrapped up in a lot of statistics about child mortality in the 16th century, which of course was very high. But almost as if the implication was that they wouldn't have been really that upset because they would have been half expecting to lose a child. And that's always really upset me. It always seemed like a hideous presumption that they didn't grieve him, because how could they have not? You know, he was 11, and you only have to read the opening scenes of Hamlet with those lenses in front of your eyes to realize that they grieved him terribly. You know, this boy was terribly missed, and he left a great chasm of loss in Stratford-upon-Avon.
So would you like to read a bit?
Yeah, sure. So this is a bit from right near the beginning, when Hamlet's twin sister, Judith, has fallen ill, and they're on their own in the house, and he's looking for a grown-up to help him. The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back towards him in a crouched position, fumbling with something, papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. Hamlet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious, his arm flailing through the air as if warding off an assailant. "Who's there?" he cries. "It's me, Hamnet." His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scared the wits out of me, boy," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamlet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell, and they've gone out." His grandfather speaks over him with a curt flick of his wrist. "What do you want with all those women, anyway?" He seizes the neck of a pitcher and aims it towards a cup. The liquid, ale, Hamlet thinks, slops out precipitously, some into the cup and some onto the papers on the table, causing his grandfather to curse, then dab at them with a sleeve. For the first time, it occurs to Hamlet that his grandfather might be drunk. "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamlet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamlet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gulping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamlet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling in his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he is in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand clear of him. Stand well back, do you hear? Hamlet believes he is keeping his word. He is well back. He is at the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out a page. Hamlet bends forward, not moving his feet, and takes it with the very tips of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out of the side of his mouth. He sits in his chair, hunched, an old, sad toad on a stone. "And this," his grandfather holds out another paper. Hamlet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. Quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Everything happens so fast that afterwards, Hamlet won't be sure in what sequence it all occurred. The page swings to the floor between them. His grandfather's hand seizes him by the wrist and the elbow, hauling him forward into the gap, the necessary space his father had told him to observe. And his other hand, which still holds the cup, is coming up fast. Hamlet is aware of streaks in his vision, red, orange, the colours of fire, before he feels the pain. It is a sharp, clubbed, jabbing pain. The rim of the cup has struck him just below the eyebrow. "That'll teach you," his grandfather is saying in a calm voice, "to creep up on people." Thank you.
Thank you. It's so good. So do you agree with William Styron's assertion that the historical novelist works best when fed on short rations? Did you? I mean, I would imagine if much is known about someone, you might feel tempted, even if you're writing fiction, to cleave to the facts. And here, especially with Anne Hathaway, you have so very little, and it allows you, it seems to me that it allows you great freedom. And I wondered how you felt about that, and if it was like, you got to just go, or if you wanted a little bit more.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I think when I was writing the book, I would have a kind of pendulum swing every now and again from one to the other. On the one hand, I found there are frustrations because, of course, there's so little known about these people. I mean, and the woman we know is Anne Hathaway, Mrs. Shakespeare. If we think we know a little about Shakespeare himself, what we know about his wife is almost non-existent. Her birth isn't even recorded in the parish records because she was born before that began to happen. So on one hand, there were days when I felt frustrated, and there was one there was a point actually which I'd realised that, of course, the two daughters, Shakespeare's two daughters, Susanna and Judith, lived to an incredibly advanced age. You know, if you think that the average life expectancy in the late 16th century in Warwickshire was 47, you know, Susanna was in her late 60s and Judith was in her early 70s when she died. And actually both of them died around the time when Shakespeare, his reputation was rising and people were actually beginning to write biographies of him and collect information about him. But what's really awful, and kind of it still twists in my gut like a knife, is that not one of these people thought to travel to Stratford and ask either of his daughters, what was he like? You know, what was it? How did he spend his days? What did he look like? You know, why did he go to London? You know, when did he start writing plays? And it's so, you know, when you think about the lost opportunities and all the information we could, so that made me kind of slightly ragey actually. But the idea that these two women who probably knew him better than most people were just, their stories and their voices were totally lost and have been lost to history and were consigned to dust. Anyway, but apart from that, I could go on about ranting about that. But but I think you're right, because on one hand, yeah, I found it very frustrating and really sad actually. You know, it's not even known where in the churchyard Hamnet is buried. It's not known where Judith is buried. The others, you can find their graves. They all have gravestones, but somewhere in that churchyard by the river is the body of Hamnet the boy, but no one knows where it is. So, but on the other hand, like you're saying, I think the kind of writer in me, I mean, it is, you know, there are these huge longeurs in the story, but in a sense, it is quite interesting as a writer to kind of, I don't know, to join the dots, I think, between those stories. But at the same time, I think the thing that I was most aware of actually while I was writing this book is that these were real people. You know, it's not that I think I really tried to steer away actually from thinking when I'd sit down, I think I'm going to write my historical capital H novel, capital N. You know, I think that would have given me quite a lot of vertigo. So I tried to treat it as I would any other novel, I think. To avoid the historical novel vertigo. But I like that William Styron quote. That's very interesting. I think in some ways it's true. But I think I always at the back of my mind, you have to try and be respectful and you have to try not to ignore any facts. I think that's something I was really careful to do. So I found as much as I possibly could about these people and I tried not to disregard anything that was absolute concrete fact. You know, even if it didn't fit in with what the narrative that I wanted to tell, I would always try and find a way to weave it in because, you know, these people were real. You can't ever forget that. And of course there is, you know, there's my Hamnet who appears in the novel who's a fictional character, but we have to remember that even though it was almost half a century ago, there was a real Hamnet Shakespeare and he lived and he died when he was 11. And you've got to always tread carefully, I think, in that way.
That all makes me want to cry into a 5-gallon drum for some reason. But what I love what you did with Agnes is that she's slightly mythy. And, you know, her beginnings in the forest and her mother and her knowledge and her knowingness. But also, she fits very well into the mold of a Maggie O'Farrell heroine in that she's unruly and she's kind of outside of time and she has to navigate through a world that is hostile to her. And one of the things as I've been reading through your wonderful oeuvre, and I would not have said ever that you needed to go or there was a next level that you would have gone to, but I think Hamnet is the next level of your work and there's something very focused about it and very deep. And I just wondered if you yourself feel that you sort of took yourself to another plane.
Well, firstly, thank you so much. That's a really, really lovely thing to say, and I really appreciate your good opinion. I don't know. I mean, in a sense, I'm probably the last person who can answer that question actually, because I think I don't know how you find it when you're writing, Jane, but I find I try really hard not to. I don't know, sort of think about my other books or the kind of whatever people might call the body of work or what people might be expecting or wanting from a book. You know, I don't know, just the idea of this kind of, you're sitting there writing and there's this kind of notional reader looking over your shoulder thinking, you know, is she gonna do something different? Is she gonna be, you know, it would be so distracting. I think first and foremost, you have to kind of, I mean, it's that thing that, I think it was Kipling who called it, you have to write from the other side of your brain. You know, in a sense, you just have to switch off the sort of conscious or self-conscious, certainly, aspect of thinking, you know, what is it I'm doing? What is this saying? You just have to immerse yourself in the narrative, and you've got to write the kind of book that you yourself would like to read, I think.
Yeah.
And you have to, you know, I don't know, you can't sort of second guess what audiences might want, because you're never going to write a good book that way. I think the best book that you can write is always going to be the one that you can't not write. You know, the one that's driving you for whatever reason, the one that has a kind of pilot light lit underneath it and that just won't go out. It's always there, and it's always, you know, and I think this one in particular was fueled by, I don't know, and it was fueled by a sense of injustice, I think, for the boy. I feel Hamnet has been overlooked too much. You know, he's never been acknowledged as such an enormous influence on literature. You know, without him, I don't think we'd have the play Hamlet, and I don't think we'd have Twelfth Night, you know, which is, you know, as you'll remember, is about boy and girl twins who've been separated and then are magically reunited. One of the most heartbreaking moments, actually, of the research for this book, I read something, and it turns out the opening night for Twelfth Night was on what would have been the twins' birthday.
Oh,
I know. It's so awful, isn't it? It's like a kind of, yeah, it's like a sucker punch. Because I remember looking at it and thinking, hang on, that date rings a bell. And I kind of looked back and I checked and I thought, oh my God, it is. And, you know, and obviously, you know, Shakespeare would have been able to choose that date. I mean, he was one of the leading players in the company. So that in itself is very significant. So, you know, I've always felt that Hamnet, the boy, has never had his due. And I suppose also during one of the things that, you know, because I originally conceived the book to be about fathers and sons and ghosts and absence and presence as the play is in some sense. But actually something that happened, you know, I don't know if you find this, Jane, when you're writing and you think you're writing a book about maybe that's going to move from A to B, but as you're writing it, it turns out you're actually writing A to C or maybe C to F, you know, the whole thing becomes a little bit, sort of takes a diversion. Something that really diverted me was reading about Agnes or Anne Hathaway, you know, and just feeling furious actually at how she's been treated by history. You know, I was so taken aback. I was totally unprepared for it, you know, because, you know, if you ask, and I don't know how she's perceived in the States actually, but if you ask anyone in this country, certainly, what do you know about the woman Shakespeare married? Or what do you know about Anne Hathaway? People are bound to say one or two things, that she forced him to marry her, she tricked him into marrying her, and that she was an older, that she was illiterate, she was a peasant. You know, there's all this kind of hatred and misogyny and hostility directed towards her by, you know, every aspect of culture, you know, right the way from scholarship and, you know, scholars and biographers, all the way down, you know, all the way to other screenwriters or other novelists. Everybody wants to perpetuate this myth that she was this cradle-snatching, ignorant strumpet that he hated, and he had to run away to London to get away from her. And there's no evidence of that anywhere. I don't know where it comes from, you know, this hostility or this sort of retrospective desire to give him a retrospective divorce. And I don't know whether it's because we desire our artists to be footloose and fancy free and open to romantic entanglements in London. It just, the whole thing made me absolutely livid. And so I think my portrayal of her came from just a wish to, you know, a desire to, you know, open their marriage up to a new interpretation, to ask readers to think again, to forget everything they think they know about her and about their marriage, and to say, actually, you know what, maybe they did love each other. Maybe it was a partnership. Yes, he worked in London, but actually that wasn't unusual for men from Stratford at the time, far from unusual. And maybe it was a partnership. Maybe a radical idea, they actually loved each other.
It's such a wonderful marriage. You know, it has its problems, but it's a beautiful marriage.
Yeah, well, I was so determined. I had one of the strange things, one of the kind of moments, a sort of lightning bolt moment for me, was reading her father's will. So her father, Richard Hathaway, who was a sheep farmer, died a year before she married William, and he left her quite a generous dowry. He was pretty well to do. He had a lot of land, quite successful. And in his will, he names her. He says, "I'm leaving a dowry to my daughter Agnes," or Agnes, it would have been pronounced then. And I was so amazed. I had to go back and read it twice. And I thought, my God, on top of everything else, have we been calling her by the wrong name for almost half a century? Surely if anyone knows her name, it's going to be her father. So
can you say her name again? How it's actually?
Well, it would have been pronounced a bit similar to the French, like Agnès or Anis. So you can see how it might have been transcribed as Anne or Anis. But that's her father names her in his will as my daughter. How we would say Agnes now, but the G would have been slightly silent because Elizabethan spelling was, obviously not as stable as it is now, which is why Hamnet and Hamlet are all the same name. There are plenty of examples in the parish records of Hamnets being born as Hamnet or Hamlet and being buried as a Hamnet or a Hamlet. There's no sort of stability in a sense in those names.
There's so much to talk about, and I want to say that I did look at Germaine Greer's Shakespeare's Wife, which you referenced, and she really takes on Stephen.
She really does.
Takes no prisoners, but
she really does. Yeah, it's a fantastic book.
I want to just talk a minute about the fun that you must have had writing the sex scene among the apples. And I have to say that I am married to an apple farmer and I live on an orchard, and we do not have a room like the one you described to store the apples.
You need to get one, Jane. You need to set one up.
Charge money and just broaden the experience for our apple customers. But I just wonder if you could describe that.
Social distancing might be a little tricky, but as long as it's from the same household.
Could you describe that room where the apples are stored? And then I just want to read the one sentence that is, I'm going to blush reading it, but anyway.
Yeah, so a friend of mine who actually has an apple orchard, like yourself, it now turns out, she was telling me that I can't remember why, she was telling me one day that how you store them, you have to store them on these long sort of runners where there are holes, grooves, and you have to turn the apple stalk down and you air them so they're not touching. So this is how you preserve them over a kind of long winter before there were refrigerators and she showed me this old apple store. For some reason it just got into my head. And I remember, because obviously with these novels you can kind of track back, and I was quite interested in the kind of seasonal cycle of it all, and I was working out when they got married and when Susanna, their first child, was born, because Agnes or Anne was 3 months pregnant when they got married, which again is really not unusual for brides at that time. I think a third of brides going to the altar were pregnant. So I was just working out what would have been happening, and I was thinking actually, well, it would have been late autumn, when she was conceived, when Susanna was conceived. So I was just thinking autumn apples, and God. Just one of those things.
So Maggie O'Farrell puts her lovers in this apple storeroom, and they start, doing it. And the line is, the apples are turning on their heads. Stalks are appearing from undersides. Calyxes are facing sideways, then backward, then upwards, then down. The pace of the knocking varies. It pauses, it slows, it builds, it pulls down again. Ah, rock, rock, jolt, jolt. I feel like the apple of original sin wasn't required to do a fraction of what these apples are doing, triple toe loops, and rendering the sex act itself. Anyway, you should be very proud of that moment.
Well, thank you. I take that as a big compliment coming from the spouse of an apple farmer.
I also think you must have had fun tracing the plague from the flea on a monkey from Alexandria to England, and I wondered if you invented all of that, and when you knew that chapter had to be in the book.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I'm not sure fun would be quite the right word, actually, when it comes to the Black Death. I tell you what, was fun actually with this book, and then I'll get on to the Black Death, was that in order to create Agnes, because there's so little about her really, and also, the more I read about her, the more distant, women of that era seemed to me. Her life was so unrecognizable compared to mine. So I felt that, that I think that for this book there was an awful lot of kind of library-based research, but particularly for Agnes, I wanted to do a bit more kind of physical research, to try and get under the skin of a woman who lived in the late 16th century, and I just thinking about the sheer labor involved in the day-to-day life of women like that, especially when, you think of someone like Shakespeare's mother, who had 8 children. You know, by the time Shakespeare married, he was 18, and she also had every age, going down to Edmund, who was 2 at the time. Even the idea of just clothing them and feeding them and cleaning up after them, and, you know, day after day after day, and creating all the food, and, you know, it just is jaw-dropping, actually. So in order to kind of get under Agnes's skin, I did a few things. I actually learned falconry. I went and I learned to fly a kestrel in a wood in the Scottish borders, and that's actually the most fun I've ever had researching for a book. And because, you know, it's only until you actually physically experience something like that. I mean, because I'd actually written a scene where she goes hawking, and I had written a scene where I described the kestrel landing on her glove with a thud. And then I flew a kestrel myself. Actually, a kestrel probably weighs as much as a kitten. I mean, it's so light, and you don't hear it coming. So you're standing with your glove, and one minute it's not there, and the next minute, whew, there it is. And it's so light that you don't even feel it. So I had to go back and obviously rewrite that scene. And I went mudlarking along the Thames. I don't know if do you know mudlarking? Is that a term? Maybe that's not a term familiar. So mudlarking is, as it suggests, you go and you wade through the filth and the oozy mud at the banks of the Thames at low tide, and you can find the most astonishing stuff, because of course the Thames, the river in London, throws up, you know, Roman coins and Tudor pins. So you can sit, I mean, obviously it throws up a lot of other really unpleasant stuff, and there's an awful lot of stuff you have to sift through, but you can find, you know, actual living physical history. So I did that, and I also planted and cultivated my own Elizabethan physic garden, so kind of medicinal plants that would have been used in those times.
The witch garden.
Well, actually, it's the kind of garden that every household in Tudor times would have had, you know, because the woman of the house would have had to cure colds or warts or cuts or, you know, anything, fevers, headaches, any of those. They had a plant that would have sorted those things out. But anyway, you were asking me about, the plague. So that chapter, so about halfway through the book, I was probably about maybe a third of the way through the book, and I suddenly felt that I needed to kind of, you know, because it's quite a hermetic book, especially in the beginning. You know, it happens mostly in one really small rural town in Warwickshire. I mean, there are kind of a few passages in London, but it's basically in rural Warwickshire, and it's in pretty much one house. And it just felt to me that we needed a bit of, I don't know, oxygen flowing through the book. And I mean, looking back at that chapter now, it is a bit odd because, you know, obviously we're all living through a pandemic that none of us saw coming at all. But I do remember, you know, thinking that I needed to sort of give some kind of global perspective on this illness that was coming. I mean, the thing is that about the Black Death is that even though it wasn't called that in those days, they called it the pestilence. My son is putting faces through the window. Stop it. I'm just going to leave that. I can't see it. It's my 17-year-old. You know, every single Elizabethan would have been terrified of it all the time. You know, they would have all known the signs and the symptoms. Stop it. Go away. Every single one of them would have known exactly what to look out for. And any sort of fever would have been treated with absolute terror and fear. And, you know, they all would have known exactly what would have happened if there was a case in your house. You know, there would have been a watchman stationed at your door for 40 days and nobody would have been allowed in or out. Whole towns would have been shut down. You know, I mean, it would have been a constant fear. I mean, Shakespeare's career was constantly interrupted by it. You know, because the first thing the civic authorities did in London, as soon as there was a case, was to shut down the playhouses. I mean, if you think that the original Globe Theatre had a capacity for 3,000 people, and you imagine all that 3,000 people gathering in the midday sun in midsummer to watch a play, you can see why it was treated as a kind of viral hotspot. So I suppose I just wanted to give a sense of the scale of it. I mean, you know, if you look at the numbers of people who died of that particular bacterial infection, it's absolutely staggering. I mean, at one point, it killed a quarter of the world's population. So there was a sense in which I suddenly sort of decided I needed to throw the book open wide, and I needed to give a sense of the perspective of this disease sweeping towards rural England. And so it is odd, actually, you know, because I remember sitting at my desk in my ergonomic chair in my nice centrally heated house and thinking, you know, what would it feel like? What would it feel like to know that there was a pandemic coming towards you? And I had all these kind of maps of Elizabethan trade routes up on the walls with big arrows showing where the route they took. And of course, they look exactly like the infographics that we were all looking at in February. You know, we were all watching it come closer and closer, and then as soon as it hit Italy, you know, as soon as it hit Italy, I think the people in Britain and Ireland knew that it was going to come here. We knew it was only a matter of time, but they looked just the same. So it is very odd. I mean, in a sense, you know, I feel the part of the book I feel most differently about since this crisis began in the last 6 months is that, you know, it seems really, it's really strange to think of it now.
Good timing, Ms. O'Farrell. But I do want to say that if this writing thing doesn't work out for you, you could do contact tracing.
Well, think about that. I think I'd be really rubbish at it, but you never know. You never know. It's always good to have a backup plan.
One thing I wonder is if you were at all, you don't strike me as somebody who is intimidated by anything, but I just wondered if it was, if it felt strange to attempt to inhabit the mind of the tutor, that is to say William Shakespeare, and to have him speak. And you have a few echoes from the plays, you know, just a few little lines or words even. But what I loved about how you rendered him is that he seems like really pretty much like an ordinary guy who's married and works a lot. And, you know, it didn't seem like you were struggling to make him sound highfalutin.
I mean, it was intimidating, certainly. And, you know, that's part of the reason why his name doesn't appear anywhere in the book. You know, I mean, the name Shakespeare doesn't appear anywhere in the book. You know, in a sense, I wanted to kind of dissociate him from Shakespeare, the icon, you know, because we all of us have, you know, our own relationship with Shakespeare inside our head. You know, he's pervaded our very language. He pervades the very way we think about ourselves. So yes, there was quite a lot of vertigo, certainly, but also I found that I couldn't really, you know, it's impossible to write a sentence or a paragraph saying William Shakespeare woke up and had some bread for breakfast. And you just instantly you feel like an absolute idiot, you know. And I felt that, you know, if I'm getting pulled out of the narrative by writing this name, you know, how can I expect readers to stay submerged in the book if I can't even write it, you know, without, you know, having this terrible shudder of horror. So it was. So I think in a sense, in a way, you know, divorcing him from his name and calling him, you know, because I mean, I suppose the book, you know, obviously the book starts when Hamnet and Judith are 11, but it also has a flashback to the marriage and their meeting and the conception of their daughter, as previously discussed. So at that point, he's 18. So I suppose in a way, you know, when he's 18, he's Shakespeare before he was Shakespeare, if you see what I mean, you know, that he was just, yeah. But I suppose, and partly was kind of wondering what he would have been like, you know, what the other inhabitants of Stratford-upon-Avon would have thought of him. I mean, he must have, you know, even then, he must have been extraordinary. He must have stuck out like a sore thumb in this sort of rural market town. You know, it's not as if not only is he the, you know, greatest writer that ever lived, I mean, it's more that no one's ever even come close. It's not as if anyone's even sort of threatening to take that crown from him. You know, you imagine what he was like when he was 18. I mean, or, you know, imagine what it would be like to be his teacher at school, you know, his Greek teacher or his rhetoric, you know, grammar school. I mean, you know, he obviously had an extraordinary mind, he must have been extraordinary from a very young age. So I suppose I was just trying to imagine what he would have been like and how people would have seen him. And I thought, well, actually, probably they would have just thought he was a bit of an odd bod, wouldn't they? I mean, farmers and other sort of yeomen and artisans must have thought, he was a bit strange, probably. So I suppose that was quite interesting. And also thinking, I mean, 18 is young. You know, it seems so, I mean, it's probably, I'm sure 18 then is different from 18 now, but 18 is pretty young. You know, you're pretty unformed at 18. I certainly was, Jesus. So I suppose, yeah, it was that. But I suppose I wanted to kind of him to be a character, but no, so certainly writing dialogue for him was the challenge. But again, you just have to kind of forget, you just got to switch off that half of your brain. And certainly I had a rule with myself, was what I called the kind of prithee line, that I was never ever ever going to attempt any kind of cod Shakespearean dialogue, you know, as in prithee or sirrah or, you know, hail fellow, well met. None. I wasn't going to use any of that, absolutely none. So what I did was kind of concentrate, instead of vocabulary, well, obviously I wasn't going to use Tudor vocabulary, but I was going to try and concentrate on cadence. So I did reread a lot of the plays just to think about the way there's quite a lot of unwords in Shakespeare, and sort of inverted negatives. So I tried in a very kind of nerdy linguistic sense. I tried to do that rather than use the prithee. That was my rule of no return.
That was a great choice. I have to give you up to the others in just a minute.
Oh yeah.
But I could talk to you for hours, not least because once upon a time I lived at 35 Drumshoe Gardens in Edinburgh, and but that maybe we'll meet in person and discuss that whole thing. But
about 2 minutes from where I live. I can actually see it if I look out of my window.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, the other thing I just would like to say, in terms of the cadence and your prose, and it feels like you kind of wrote the book on one breath. And especially when Agnes is giving birth and when she's facing the death of her child, there's the music of your sentences is so beautiful, and I think it would be easy to maybe take it too far, but you don't. And I just want to know that you worked really hard on those sentences and they just didn't come to you.
I did.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I wish I could say, no, I wrote it all in 4 weeks and I didn't stop and I never redrafted it.
Well, I
didn't even look back. And my editor said, it's absolutely perfect, don't change a word. No.
Well,
in my dreams, you know that, Jane.
Your sentences are a glory. So anyway, I'm going to hand you over to Daniel because I know that people have questions for you, but it's been a joy to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jane. It was so fabulous to almost meet you. Next time you're in Edinburgh, you must let me know.
Thank you. I will. Okay, Daniel.
Jane might have more questions. It sounds like she might have some backup because
people are shy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. There's a question that yes.
People are shy.
Okay. Well, there was a question that came in earlier, and
I am quite scary. It's true.
This question is from Erin Zess, and she says, "I'm interested in the powers of perception lent to the character of Agnes, her ability to experience emotions as images, to hold other people's stories in her hands. In my reading, these mystical insights or embodied metaphors give a rich physical texture to both the joy and grief of the story. But I'm wondering what your intentions were." And I just want to say that I think this is a beautiful question, and also that no author ever has to really disclose what her intentions were if you don't feel like it.
Well, I think it goes back, I think it has its origin going back to thinking about Shakespeare as a young man, as he was when she first met him. And actually, it's something that that I came across in Germaine Greer's book, actually, Shakespeare's Wife. She says in it that history is always asked, why did he marry her? Why did he, this brilliant genius, stoop to marry this peasant woman who was probably illiterate? You know, why did he marry her? And actually she says that the question we should have been asking was, why did she marry him? You know, she at the time was 26, which is about the average age of a woman to get married, and she was pretty well to do. She had a very good dowry. She came from a very respectable family. She was quite a catch, really. Whereas he, on the other hand, was 18. He was pretty tradeless. He had a good education, but not a great deal else. No kind of practical skill. He wasn't yet old enough to marry. And also his family, his father, who you saw in my book there with Hamnet, he had been a very successful, he was probably the most successful glove maker in Stratford, and so he'd been a pretty successful businessman, but he'd experienced this quite dramatic fall from grace. He'd been a high alderman, which gave you all kind of religious and sort of civic duties, but he'd been started illegally wool trading, and he was in huge amounts of debt. He was no longer an alderman. He was I think it's probably likely he very rarely left the house because he had huge creditors. He'd been summoned to court for not attending church and for dumping what's described as ordure in a street. You can imagine what that might be. So what had happened, that their family had this big fall from grace. So he was from a family that was in disgrace and was having severe money and legal problems. So, I love the idea that actually everyone's got this question the wrong way around. But then I was thinking, well, I wonder why she did marry him, and is it possible that she saw something in him that nobody else at that time had seen? Maybe she could look at this 18-year-old lad and see something extraordinary about him. So that's where her kind of idea of perception and being able to read people's characters or see deeply into people. But also, you know, I was interested in the idea of portraying a marriage that was a partnership, you know, that she has her own brand of artistry to match his, you know, and perhaps there was an exchange going on. Because obviously one of the things that amazes me about Shakespeare, as it does many people, is just the range of his metaphors and the incredible depth of knowledge he displays on a vast array of subjects. And you know, obviously in Hamlet particularly, he displays a very in-depth and informed knowledge of herbology or plants, particularly in the scene where the mad Ophelia hands people plants that are a very specific match for a flaw she sees in their character. And also hawking, there's a great deal about metaphors about hawking in his plays. So I decided to give these two forms of artistry to her, because I quite like the idea that maybe he gathered quite a lot of knowledge from her. Maybe it wasn't. I mean, perhaps, you know, I find it really frustrating that she probably couldn't read, because why would a woman in that time, the daughter of a sheep farmer, have been taught to read? She wouldn't have had the chance. But being illiterate does not make you stupid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I like Germaine Greer suggests that perhaps in their early courtship and marriage, the tutor taught her to read.
Yes, wouldn't that be nice? I hope so. I mean, his daughter, certainly, his elder daughter Susanna was obviously quite literate. There's quite a lot of examples of her handwriting, and she married a doctor actually later in life, and she kept a lot of his accounts for him. But his younger daughter Judith, Hamlet's twin, the only example of her signature is just a J. It's just her initial, and it's upside down and back to front, which makes me wonder whether she was dyslexic.
Which is another one of your interests, as we know, if we have read
that's right.
If we've read your body of work. One of the things that I love so much is the tender way you describe children and their physiques and their hair and their skin, and the tenderness of mothers to children, and also another thing that interested in me was that you had Agnes wish to give birth in the forest. Has that ever been an urge of yours? And your three?
Yes, I mean, I wish I would. Wouldn't it be great if I could have done? Unfortunately, I had to have 3 elective cesareans. So
right.
I did not have them in a forest. I should point that in a very kind of overlit hospital room. I know, it would have been great though, wouldn't it? I mean, I don't know, the thing about children, I think, is just because I'm totally besotted with my own children, I think. But it's funny, I mean, my children, you know, I think I couldn't have written this book. One of the things, you know, because it is a book I wanted to write for a really long time. And in a sense, I don't know, I think maybe I couldn't have written it unless my children were the age they are. You know, something that really held me back from writing it was a kind of odd superstition, actually. I mean, I'm not a very superstitious person, I should say, but I found that actually I couldn't write the book. I did try several times, and actually I tried 3 times properly, and I swerved away each time and wrote another book. So I've written 3 books instead of writing this one. And the book I wrote previously was a memoir, and when I finished it, I kind of sat myself down. I thought, no, I said, you either have to write this book or you've got to forget about it. But the thing I realized that was stalling me is because so I have a boy and 2 girls, as the Shakespeares did, and I couldn't do it until my own son was past the age of 11, because I knew that I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who sits at her son's bedside and is forced to watch him die, and then has to lay him out for burial.
Which is the shroud. I mean, that is just, I will never ever forget that. It's just, it's a comfort actually to go through that grief. And I think if people say, oh, you know, I'm afraid to read it, it's like, no, it's actually a comfort. I find that you are you're very good at endings, and I feel that you give the reader just the right amount. I'm thinking of Esme Lennox, and you don't tell too much, but everybody knows what's occurred, and it's kind of thrilling in its way. And you know, I think it's very hard for many writers to have satisfactory endings, and I wonder if that's just one of your natural gifts, or if, you know, you
I think endings are hard. I don't know if you find this. I think I don't know, I mean, they can't, you know, because obviously it has to be, you've got to end, I suppose, I'm not expressing this very well, but I suppose the kind of ending that I like to read in a book is one that doesn't answer every single question a reader might have and doesn't sew up every single kind of loose thread. I find that if I do read a book that does that, has this very, very conclusive ending, I find that the book sort of doesn't stay long in my head. It tends to sort of drift off. But if I read an ending which leaves me with a few questions, and I can sort of imagine or question the kind of meta life of the characters after the final page is closed, those books I feel remain in my head for a lot longer in a very satisfactory way. But in a sense, I mean, it's funny, I always knew that Esme Lennox would end the way it did. But I always knew actually that this book, you know, because sometimes I found so it goes back to what I was saying, you know, you plan for a book to go in one direction and it goes off in another. And I found that sometimes endings sort of alter and ameliorate as you're going along. But I always knew that Hamnet would end with the play. I knew that it would end with the early production of Hamlet. You know, I read somewhere a story, which is possibly apocryphal, I don't know, but that Shakespeare himself did take the part of the ghost in the original production of Hamlet. And, you know, that was too much of a gift. It was too much of a gift to ignore. You know, just the idea of him up there on the stage of the Globe in the makeup as the ghost, it was just, you know, it's real shivers down your spine. So I always knew the book would end with that. And also, but I'd always had the question in my head, which was, you know, I wonder how Hamlet's mother felt about her husband calling play after their dead son. You know, I'm not sure I would have been thrilled if it had been me.
Okay, my question is, do you have to know a lot about Shakespeare to enjoy and understand your book?
No, I don't think so. I think you could have lived down a well and not know who Shakespeare was, and it wouldn't make a difference, actually.
I agree. I really enjoyed preparing for this chat, and in so doing, I went to the Globe Theater and I watched the most recent Hamlet that's up to stream, and in it, I think their goal is to have the viewer not see gender at all, because Hamlet's
as a woman. Oh yes, yeah.
So the actors are playing them in an ungendered way, even though. And so, you know, Ophelia is this gorgeous, black, very tall man in a dress, but he's not acting as if he's not doing drag. And I just wonder what Shakespeare, I mean, the plays are so gendered. And so to watch the plays, you have to sort of erase gender, but you can't. And I'm old, okay? So maybe I'm just not groovy enough to really get the experience. But I just wonder what he would have thought of this sort of twist that I'm not sure really does anything.
I don't know. I mean, I've seen some of those Globe productions where they kind of gender blind or whatever you want, for want of a better word, but I find them quite interesting. And I also think, you know, we have to remember that, of course, in Shakespeare's time, women weren't allowed on stage. So the women in his plays, you know, Ophelia and Gertrude, and would have been played by young boys being women. And then you get those kind of reversals where often in his plays, you know, particularly the comedies, the boys and girls change clothes. So then you'd get a boy playing a girl pretending to be a boy, and you know, you get all these kind of layers of gender. And
I saw the Mark Rylance production with the Globe where he you know, and he's playing it as a woman. He's not trying to not be a woman. That was my with it. But anyway, it is interesting, and I would like Shakespeare. I would like to see a series where, like a Netflix thing, where Shakespeare is called back to save a writer's room from the fact that they can't do their series, and you know how that all goes. I don't know.
My husband still talks about when he was a teenager, he saw Daniel Day-Lewis playing Hamlet at the National Theatre, and I'm so jealous. Retrospectively, I know 30 years ago, I think, oh damn, I would have liked to have seen that production, but I didn't.
Okay, the last question, which is often a good last question, is what are you reading currently?
Oh, well, I am reading, I have just finished Lauren Groff's short stories, Florida. And oh my goodness, they're amazing. I actually had to stop reading them late at night because a few of them were so disturbing. I could not sleep. There's one in particular of a young woman who's with her young kids alone in a house in the middle of nowhere, and she gets concussion and she has to stay awake for a whole night. God, it's so good. So I've absolutely loved those. Yeah, I can't wait for her next novel. I hope she's writing one because I would really like one. If you're listening, Lauren, please hurry up. There are people waiting.
And also, I think everybody who doesn't believe in climate change or otherwise should read that book. It's
oh God,
really,
yes,
it's very good that way. Maggie O'Farrell, thank you for being with us. We will wait patiently to see what you write next and enjoy your backlist in the meantime. But thank you for this book and thank you for being here. And thank you to Daniel and Kayleen and all of you for being here on this Zoom call.
That's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jane. It was fantastic. And it was such a pleasure to chat to you. And thank you all so much for having me. It was really nice. Thank you for tuning in. I hope to make it to the States at some point in person. That would be lovely.
I wanted to thank Jane Hamilton and Kayleen for our host, co-host, and our amazing conversation partner. Thank you very much, Maggie O'Farrell. Thank you to all of you for coming, because we wouldn't have a virtual event series without you. Hope to see you at another one. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.